What's up, everyone? How's it going? Happy Monday. Also, hey to Dustin. How you doing, Dustin?
Hey, happy Monday. It's good to be back. It's a beautiful day this morning.
It is. Hey to everyone who we have in the chat and around. Let us know if you have any questions for us. So welcome back to part 3. So I had to get my head around that because I was not here for last week's stream. But yeah, part 3 of this product visualization stream. And before we get into what we're going to be doing today, which is a little bit of texturing, I've got a little bit of housekeeping. So let me just add my screen in here. So yeah, again, sort of doing the producing and doing the housekeeping as well. But yeah, let me just link this in the chat and I can go through all these different links for everyone. Also, hey to Sharon in the chat. So yeah, let me just link that page to everyone. So this is our new landing page for Creative Maxon. It has all the links that we tend to talk about at the start of these live streams. So things like Maxon events, our YouTube channel, grab yourselves a free t-shirt, and then Cineversity. And what you can also do is, as you know, we also run a live Ask the Trainer on YouTube. If you have any questions for us, this link also has a sort of a questionnaire. So if you have any questions that you would like us to answer live on that Ask the Trainer live stream, then definitely do that and check that out. So yeah, a quick look at those links is we have our own events page. If you haven't seen it before, it's basically where we promote all of the live streams we have going on, as well as in-person events. And then all of our live streams actually get recorded. So they're normally hosted on the various different YouTube channels. So the Maxon training team, Maxon, Red Giant, the ZBrush one, depending on the topic. But all of them actually get recorded and get uploaded onto only the Maxon training team channel. And they're also timestamped by Dr. Sassy. So shout out to Dr. Sassy. Thank you for that. So yeah, if you ever miss anything or we kind of go too quickly and want to go back over it, then just check it out on the training team YouTube channel. We've also been going through updating Cineversity. So this is our kind of educational platform where we have a bunch of new series for getting started or sort of just understanding and learning the new features. So for example, Pyro or Particles, there's entire series on there that you can learn about. And then finally, that last link is we like to thank you for being part of our great community by giving away free t-shirts. And the code for that, so it's kind of password protected, is C4D Quick Treats. So that's the passcode you need to access this merch store. Grab yourselves a free t-shirt. All you have to do is pay for the shipping, and depending where you live will depend on how much that costs you. So those are the sort of links that are all on this landing page that is actually now linked in the chat. So let me just scroll up there. Yeah, so thank you for being part of our live streams. We appreciate it. So I wasn't here last week, but Dustin, I checked out a little bit of the stream and you dove into some different lighting techniques and actually finalized this shot here that I know we worked on in week 1.
Yeah, it was a good process. Thanks to all of those great patient people out there while Thanasis and I ran way over this stream time as we normally do. It was a good time. So pretty much what we did is we took the initial simulation that we started with and we made that editable. And what that allowed us to do was kind of move things around in the scene. So I just created what could kind of look like a nice swirl of gummies or jellies that are moving around the bag here. And kind of prepared a bit more for this week. And what we'll be doing is discussing some of the texturing side in Photoshop, and Elly's actually going to do that. So that's going to be pretty cool because I'll be able to sit in the sideline and just kind of be like the peanut gallery backseat driver on that one. And then we'll go into Cinema 4D and Redshift, and both she and I will be probably sharing screens back and forth, discussing certain parts of the project. Now on my side, it's going to be a bit more talking about how I adjust things once I get the textures and everything put into Cinema 4D and Redshift. and maybe how I manipulate my lights now that I have materials on things. Because obviously, materials are going to be adjusting the way that that lighting looks on our product. So it's going to be interesting. I'm hoping that we don't go a full hour and 45 minutes, like today, like we did last week.
That's the challenge today.
We won't. Yeah, I feel like that was almost a new milestone. So we won't keep you all as long as we did then, but it will definitely be a good time.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. Also, hey to everyone else who's kind of joined the chat, to Junkyard Carnival, to Amin, George, Goatom, and Andreas. Nice to see you all. So if you have any questions for us, there is a chat section in YouTube. Feel free to just drop your questions in there. Both me and Dustin will be keeping an eye on it. If you can just title or start the sentence with a capital question, it's not a massive deal. It just helps us out as we're looking in the back end for those questions. And Andreas, to answer yours, you're asking about the old University tutorials and will they be eventually on the new site? Yes, as far as I'm aware, the process is that we have a team kind of converting them from the old University to the new one, because we can appreciate there's so much amazing content on the old one. But that's also why it's still available, is because we don't want to completely shut that off. So yeah, as far as I know, that will be moved over, as well as just some other like cool tutorials that we see on YouTube that aren't necessarily Maxon tutorials. We want to kind of share those as much as we can. So if you know of any, then just, let us know. Cool, yeah, so let's get into it. Let's kind of move us down here. Hopefully we shouldn't really be in the way too much here. If we are, we can just move us around. But yeah, let's get into like some texturing. So yeah, when we first looked at this project back in week 1, we took this jelly bag asset from the asset browser. And so that, just really quickly, for anyone who didn't see that part, we can just kind of go into our models and then we can find packaging. And then we have this jelly bag here, as well as loads of other cool models and kind of materials that we can use in our projects. But this actually comes with its own texture. So if I go into my material manager, this was the original texture, the original material that was used on the jelly packet. And it comes with its sort of this image here. So this is sort of what's been controlling the base color. So if we come in close, we don't need to worry about everything else just yet. We can talk about that a little bit later on. But the thing that's really controlling the color and the design of this packaging is this texture here. And we can see, if we just sort of like locate the image, what it does is it shows us where that texture is sort of saved and can be found in the asset browser. And you're probably wondering, like, why is this a useful thing? Well, what we can do is, if we just kind of double click that, we can load it into our picture viewer. And we can see this is exactly the texture that is being projected onto that packaging and giving it the, that nice final look. What we can do here is we can actually save this out, and then we can use it as a guide to create our own type of packaging. And that's what I thought I would do in the first sort of section of the stream. And because I looked at this and I thought, it's okay. Like it's not too bad, but I thought, let's maybe bring like Tom's Jellies into like the 21st century a little bit. And so you can just save this image, and then you can bring it into any software that you choose. I'm more familiar with Photoshop. And so what I did was I just pulled this into Photoshop. Let me just open this up. And let me just kind of get a bit closer. Here we go. So this is the original. Let me just enlarge this a little bit so we can see everything. So this is the original. You can see this is just sort of the original packaging that we had. And it's just like a single JPEG or single PNG that I brought into Photoshop. And then what I did was I wanted to, as I said, like recreate a different version of it. And so if I just pull this on, I'm getting used to using the wrong shortcuts for different things. Here we go. This is the trouble. Dustin, do you have this issue when you go back and forth from different software? Like when I go C4D to Photoshop, I am using the same shortcuts in the wrong tool.
100%.
Yeah.
Every day.
Yeah. It's around one.
Yeah, so I freelance or contract at a couple different studios, and recently I've been flipping back and forth between Mac and PC.
Oh yeah.
It's been an interesting it's been very interesting. So yeah, I get that. Between software, between operating systems and different platforms, yeah, it gets pretty wild.
Yeah. No, I'm glad to hear it's not just me then. Hopefully everyone else does that. So yeah, this is kind of like what I designed. And let me just, if I just take this actually, let me just paste this on here so we can kind of see, we can kind of get an idea of, so this was the original. And this is kind of the new version that was created. And you can sort of see if I just like reduce the opacity on this, I've sort of kept everything in the same place. So I've used it as a guide. So that I know when I then put this back onto the packaging or back onto the model inside of Cinema 4D and in Redshift, everything is going to match up properly and as it should based on sort of either the UVing or the original texture. So I'm not necessarily going to worry about talking too much about the actual design because this is more of like the 3D sort of focus, but just sort of updated the packaging, created this little background here inside of Illustrator with a little bit of a color overlay. Match the colors to match the particular flavor. So I wanted to keep the flavor to the original, which was sort of the orange jellies. And I thought I'd create like a little bit of like a funny tagline of like, get a little fruity, and then just throw some extra elements in there just to make it look a little bit kind of nicer, maybe a little bit more 21st century, a bit more clean, a bit more modern in comparison to the original. No disrespect to the original. So whoever made it, thank you. It was a great guide. And then what I did was just to kind of take it a little bit further and then have more options inside of C4D and Redshift. I then created additional flavors. And so you can see it's literally just taking the same sort of pattern, the same sort of design here, and then just updating the colors to represent those different flavors. So we have orange, lemon and lime, apple and blackcurrant, and strawberry and raspberry. And so they have two main colors, which can then be the colors that we use when we go inside of Cinema 4D and Redshift. And so we can update the jellies, we can update the background, and we can really play around with the sort of like two contrasting or complementary colors that we have on each of these. And so the next step was I then just saved all these out as just like PNGs. Because I didn't need every individual part of this. It just needs to be a single texture. And then I threw them all inside of a single Photoshop file. And I'm going to show why this is useful in a sec. But basically all we have is just all four of these as like single JPEGs or PNGs inside of a single PSD file. And it's saved as a PSD. So let's take a look back inside of C4D and see how we can kind of use this now and start to add some textures. So let me just find where I saved these. If you've watched me on a stream, you know I'm notoriously unorganized. So here we go. Textures. All right, perfect. Cool. Right. So let's get rid of that. And we already have a material here that is loaded onto this jelly bag. And so we don't need it on the cloner for now. We can just leave it on the jelly bag. And let me just open up my render view. So this is going to give me a nice preview of my lighting, or I say my lighting, of Dustin's lighting from last week, which we can see here, and that nice depth of field. What I might do just in the meantime, I'm going to switch off my depth of field just while I'm working. This is just a personal preference I like to do so I can sort of get an idea of how my textures are looking. And again, we're going to look at sort of upresing and subdividing or using tessellation and Redshift in a little bit. But for now, we're just going to worry about loading our new packaging designs in here. So in my node editor, we're just going to build up this material from scratch. So I'm going to take my PSD file. So this is the one here that has all of those in that I created. I'm just going to drag and drop that into my node editor. And we can press no, and I can just get rid of that now. And so in here, what we want this to do is we want this same as the original packaging design, we want this to be controlling the base color of our texture. So if we just take our output color and connect that to our base, we can now see that we're getting that preview, we're getting that base color. At the moment, we haven't got anything else, so it doesn't look too great, but for now, we're just kind of looking at this PSD file. And so the reason that I did this in a PSD is because it allows me for so much control inside of Redshift. And so instead of having to save each and every one out as a single PNG or a JPEG, upload them in, and then have to sort of load each one and create 4 different textures, I'm able to do this all inside of this layer tab. And so because this is a PSD file, it's a multi-layered PSD file, I'm able to come into my layer and I can choose which layer I want to be represented within that texture node. And so without having to come in and load a different texture each time, I can just come in and I can select the flavor of the packaging that I'm after based on that PSD file. So if you don't use PSD files or multi-layer ones in Redshift and you do work like this, I would seriously recommend you do that, because it's just going to save, you having to worry about retexturing easily. So let's go with the original, the sort of like the orange one, just like the original kind of packaging design was. And so the next step here is to then think about the other things, the other parameters and options inside of our materials. And so as we know, when we select our standard material, we have a variety of different options, in particular, looking at our roughness and reflection. And that's a nice way of really adding some different variation to sort of our packaging. So at the moment, we've just got a roughness slider here that we could have a really sort of like rough texture, or we could have a really sort of smooth, glossy texture. But what if we want to look at our design and take it that next step further and use our design to then generate some sort of varying roughness? And so what I mean by that is, if I just sort of like come back into Photoshop and come back into my original design. So we're just going to look at this orange one here for now. So if I open this up, what we have is we have all of like the main text elements just grouped really simply inside of there. And that allows me to switch those on or off. We then have our pattern, and then we have our background color. What we could do is, if I switch off my color overlay, we can create, or we can take this original pattern that was created in Illustrator, and we can save this out as an additional texture file. And so when we look at roughness inside of Cinema 4D, this roughness value that goes from 0 to 1, this can be represented by color values. So for example, the color, or sort of the color black, will translate into a roughness value of 0, and the white color will translate into a roughness value of 1. So if I take that texture, that black and white textures, which I think I've saved them all here. So here we go, this orange one here. And let me just upload this. Let me just load this so you can see it. Which one is that? Roughness orange. So this here. This is what we've just saved, and this is now what we've loaded into the node editor. And so this matches that sort of like strange little pattern in the background. And then what we can do is we can use this to control the roughness. So I can create it in a way where all of these white areas now can be sort of slightly diffuse, so they won't be shiny. And all the black areas will be glossy and shiny, creating that extra little element, that extra little variation on our packaging. So we've just uploaded that. And let's just load this. And then we can connect that into our reflection roughness. So inside of here. And so now we can see the areas here are now shiny, and these areas in between are now really diffuse. So we have really strong values of 0 and 1. They're really absolute values at the moment. And then what we can do If we don't want to have this heavy of a contrast, and we want to have a little bit more variation, we can actually take advantage of a ramp node. And if we just select that and highlight that over our branch, it uploads that for us. So it builds that connection, and we can now see those two different colors. So we have the gray and we have the black. And if we don't want to have too heavy of a contrast on our roughness, we can pull in those colors. So we can pull this down. So in our black, we can adjust the value, and let's maybe say something like 10%. So it's not 100% black. So now we won't have that really kind of like glossy roughness. And then we can do the opposite on the white. That's the really kind of diffuse side, maybe something like 33%. And so now we can see we don't have too heavy of a contrast. We have a little bit of sort of roughness going on, but it's not extremely diffuse, which if we're thinking about maybe like a sweet packet or something like that, or a crisp packet, we have that quite glossy coating over the top. And then we have that other little area in here. And then we can still take this design again to add some extra sort of variation or interesting elements. So we could use it inside of a bump node, and we can use it as a bump map and create these little ridges along here. So we can see this is really, really heavy at the moment, and that's because by default, this is set to a height scale of 1 centimeter, but our packaging is really small. So let's maybe drop this down to 0.1 or maybe even 0.01. And this is because the packaging is in the real world scale. So it's very, very tiny. If you are creating larger elements in your scene, you can work with larger values in your bump. So we now have these little edges across here. And what we could even do is we can come back to the original jelly bag. So this is what we have here. We have the base color that we've just set up. And then we also have the normal map and a Maxon noise that's creating some additional elements. And these are being blended together inside of a bump blender. So this works in the same way as a displacement blender. We can actually blend multiple different bump maps together based on this node. We connect them into the different inputs, and then we can add a blend weight to blend between those different bump maps. And if we do an additive mode, it's going to add those bump maps on top of one another, which is what's happening here. So let's
the cool part, the coolest part for me about that is that they don't have to specifically be like tangent space normals. Like you can actually have a height map and tangent space normals blended together in two separate chains there. And it's, once I figured that out, I mean, quite a while ago, actually, at this point. But it was an amazing, it was an amazing thing with blending textures and different stuff, especially, I mean, on a bag, you know, a bag style product, you know, this may not be like the most ideal scenario. But if you start to get into like cardboard boxes and packaging like that, where they do like the embossed and much more of like the foil logos and different stuff of that nature, it gets really cool to be able to blend a bunch of different types of maps together. Yeah, it works out pretty well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. A little like side thing you were saying about how you can combine normal maps and then height maps. If you're just combining height maps, a little sort of like bit of advice here, I wouldn't necessarily worry about going the bump blender route. So if you're only going with height maps, so the grayscale height maps, it's better to use a color layer to combine those in a single. So for example, we have a node called the color layer node. So if you're only working with grayscale bump maps or height maps, the better workflow is to combine them all in a color layer and then put them into a single bump map. But if you're combining, as Dustin said, normal maps and height maps or bump maps together, then yeah, bump blender is definitely the way to go for that. And the process is the same for displacement blender as well. So we can do a similar thing and we can blend displacement textures together. So let's just steal this because it's already preset for us from the original. So why wouldn't we want to just take advantage? Paste that into my new setup. I can then combine this one as well. So what I could do is, let me just get that so we can see how this looks. I can connect this straight into my bump map. So then we're going to see we now have this nice little kind of like packaging waviness going over here, but we've lost that edge that we had. And so if we want to keep that, we can just throw this into our, what do we want, layer 1 bump input. And then we can just increase the blend weight. And because it's on additive mode, it's going to combine this with the bump that we just set up now, which is the normal, and this Maxon noise.
So we do have a question here from Junkyard Carnival. Do you only use PSD file for the color channel? You definitely don't have to, because you can choose the different layers within a PSD file. In most cases, this may not be something that you'll want to load all of your textures for, say, like a concrete material into one PSD file. It's a little bit easier to see them and visualize when you're mixing and matching inside of a folder if they're not all in one file, especially when you're sharing with different artists. But when you're working on packaging, a lot of the alpha channels and things that you're going to create can all be done inside of one PSD. And this makes it very easy to quickly pull out the roughness channels and the color channel, your different reflective channels. And even if you want to pull out like specific alphas, for instance, to make like a gold or a silver foil, on your product, it's very easy to just pull those channels directly out of a PSD. And it's also faster to work that way inside of Photoshop anyway. So it doesn't have to be just the color channel, but I think there are use cases where you would put them all inside of one, and then also where you would split them out into their own images.
Yeah. Cool. Right. Yeah. So that is sort of as far as I really want to go with those different textures. And so like Dustin just said, if a good method that I probably could have done is to have put the roughness ones, which are matching the different patterns, all into a single PSD, or they all could have just been thrown into the same one. And then as I update this sort of with the different flavors, I'd need to update my roughness so it matches that pattern. So yeah, that goes along with what Dustin said. I could have done it for the roughness as well if I wanted to. But yeah, it's however you want to work, really. Different kind of workflows for different things. So I'm going to leave it there with the packaging because I know we're sort of already at like past. But yeah, that's a nice little setup with the PSD file, how we can then take advantage of sort of extra things out of the box to add some different variation, as well as using some of the original stuff from the original material, like this bump map setup here. Cool. So a quick side thing that I wanted to talk about is if you took part in week 1, you'll know that when we created this animation, we worked with a really, really low res mesh for these little jellies. And this helped us out because we were simulating using sort of like dynamics and the higher resolution mesh, the underperforming certain things can be. So we made this really low res. So if I just take, what should I take? Should I take it all? Let's take it all. Let's just take it all in here and paste this in and come in here. We can see if I get really close, hopefully this is really like visible for the stream. We can see that this is extremely low resolution. And as I said, the benefit of this was that we were able to work really fast inside, especially when it comes to like simulating and creating an animation. This is now a still, because it was made editable in last week, which is fine, but we still want to up-res it in case we have some of those jellies up close to the camera. We'll be able to see those rough edges, and so it doesn't help us sell the 3D design. So just for the sake of this, let me throw in a dome light and then just drop in a HDR image, just really nice and simple. Dustin will probably be crying at my lack of lighting here. It's just for show. It's just for show. So yeah, we can see that this is very low res. And we can see, because this was a cloner that was made editable, we have all of these different instances. And many of you might be thinking, Elly, you can just throw a Redshift object tag on and tessellate. And you'd be right, and that is the process. But there's a couple of things we need to bear in mind when we're actually using this workflow. And so this is the object that's being instanced to create this cool looking design. And so if I throw my Redshift object tag on here, what we need to do is we come to geometry and we override it. And this is where we control our displacement as well. And then we normally, what we would do is we'd enable our tessellation. Hopefully through the stream it's visible that we can see that nothing has actually happened in my render view. Whereas normally what would happen is it would tessellate, which is subdivide, and it creates smooth geometry or a smoother geometry in my render view. The reason that this doesn't work is because if we're instancing an object with a Redshift object tag on, the instance mode needs to be set to instance, not render instance. And so this is set to render instance because the cloner originally was set to render instance. So for example, if I show you here, cloner instance, we have this mode, instance, render instance, multi-instance. Depending on what this is on, when we make it editable, it will create different things for us, either a copy, an instance, or a multi-instance. So what we need to do is, if we're working with this workflow, we can come in and we can just do a little simple hack, and we can just select all our instances just by using the little filter tab. And then we can set this to instance. And then we'll see this now works correctly. So we're now able to have that up-res tessellation inside of that using the Redshift object tag. Another option, if you did want to keep them to render instancing and be more wary of this workflow, is by not using the Redshift object tag. And then we could add a subdivision surface to it, or a little trick inside our nodes. We have a subdivide node. So it's a node operator. And we can just drop that on the gummy. And then we can smooth that and then create some subdivisions. But bear in mind, this is now up-resing the actual mesh. So it's all happening in the viewport, as opposed to using the Redshift object tag that is doing it at render time.
So what are the best times to use that? I guess either of these methods.
So, I mean, if you're working with an animation, you wouldn't have made the cloner editable anyway. And so then when you throw the Redshift object tag just on the cloner, it would have been fine. But because this was then made editable, we then have to think about how we want to do it. If it's a still, I suppose, in my opinion, either option works because it's a still. So we can have higher resolution geometry, or we can have tessellation at render time. I don't know if you have a thought on that, or
yeah. So I kind of asked a question just to ask the question and see what your take was, because I definitely have my preferences.
Okay.
Just kill your machine and use a subdivision surface and test the limits and power of your machine. That's probably the worst advice I've ever given, and it was the way that I used to do it. I would just throw a subdivision surface on and reap the lack of benefits that I had. So there are things to consider. So I get very heavy with materials personally. I love material creation, and I can get into materials that have, I don't know, probably at times close to 100 nodes like within the tree, and it just gets wild, and I'm mixing and matching different alphas and materials together and all kinds of things. And that can be a lot to process when I get to Redshift anyway. And so there are times that, and that's really just on my machine. It's all knowing the limits of what your machine can handle when it comes time to do these kind of things. So what I find is that when I'm working on simpler projects, you know, like this is actually a semi, like I would consider this like a sleeper project. it doesn't look like it's a whole lot, but when you slap a subdivision surface on there and you start to move things around the scene, like it can get a little bit clunky because there's so many of these gummies that can be, heavily tessellated or, have a ton of different subdivisions in them, and things get wild. So the tessellation inside the object node works good on stuff like this. Most of the time for stills, like I like to use a subdivision surface when I'm able, and that's because I can see things in the viewport exactly how they're going to be inside the render view, and it can make a lot of processes faster, more just like in the critical thinking side of it. But yeah, use as low subdivision stuff as you can when you're talking animation and heavy scenes, and then do what you like, especially if you're using a render farm. Like I would just go the route of kind of a render time tessellation for that for sure.
No, that's cool. That's good to know. Good to know. Also, I've had a quick question from Rami saying, does the normal map of the original texture work with the new design? Yes, it does, because it's more based on the kind of the mesh of the packaging. And so because the object is still the same, we can sort of come in here, we can see that the normal map is based on the mesh and the object. And because we haven't played around with that at all, we've just really changed the base color. So this is just the base color that we've really updated and then added a little bit of kind of roughness here. But the normal map is still going to map fine because we're using the original geometry still. Okay, so one final quick thing, and then Dustin, I'm going to hand it over to you, is I know it's something that we sort of like talking about, and that is just really quickly, if we'd kept this gummy inside of a cloner and not made it editable, one, we would have been able to keep that animation, but two, it allows us to take advantage of color user data. And so I don't want to spend too much time talking about this. I just want to show you how we can take color user data and then we can just update colors of clones really, really easily inside of there. So let me just throw this inside of a cloner and then make these smaller. And then we can see just like a really simple setup. Really simple setup. Let me just steal that dome light again. Beautiful lighting. Okay. So we have this cloner setup. So this is obviously a basic version of the setup that we made in week 1, which has since been made editable. So we no longer have access to the cloner. But if we did have access to the cloner, we can throw a material on there. And then what we can do is we can take advantage of color user data. So I'm just double clicking and creating the color user data node. And then we have different options in here. We can define MoGraph color, the index ratio, and we can look at things like the display color and other things like that. But a pretty cool one is if I just connect this to the base color, we have geometry ID color. And what this does is it assigns a individual color to each individual clone. And so this is really cool because what we can then do is we can colorize this based on, I don't know, maybe the color of our jellies. So one of the sort of like packaging designs we had was apple and blackcurrant. So we kind of had like purple and green jellies. We could have purple and green jellies. So the way that we can do that is, again, using the ramp node, which is probably one of the most versatile nodes inside of Redshift for many, many different purposes. We can then colorize this. So we can now see we have a grayscale sort of setup. What we can do is we can come in and we could maybe create, I don't know, like a purple color. I'm just going to keep this like really, really simple. Do a purple color and then maybe a green for our apple. And then if we just set this to step and pull this in here, what we can then do is we can colorize our clones or our little jellies and gummies really, really easily using color user data and then colorizing with the ramp. So this is a workflow if you do work a lot with MoGraph or work a lot with a cloner. and want to have different sort of like random colors, then this is a cool workflow for you that I wanted to really, really quickly just show before I hand over to you, Dustin. So what I'm going to do is, because I know we're going to be working on the same project file, I'm actually going to save this and send it over to you. But what I haven't done on here is I haven't done the Redshift object tag. So you're welcome to do what you want to do with the subject.
Yeah, I might just leave it. I think we'll just leave it for the sake of rendering, and we'll see we'll see how that works, because we do have the depth of field in there.
Yeah,
maybe that will help a little bit.
Cool. So while I'm doing this, I was thinking, because I know you're very much the lighting expert, is there sort of, do you have like an idea in mind of, once you've looked at texturing, how you would then maybe, do you then look at your lighting and then maybe make some tweaks and update it?
Yeah, most of the time. So the lighting that I do in the beginning, in that first stage, is generally just kind of the initial look development. You know, it's what I would send to the client and say, hey, this is the lighting scheme, the camera angle, even the depth of field that we're looking at. And then once we get to materials, there's almost always going to be a process of adjusting and rebalancing the lights. So in, I think, week one, we are looking at more of a white bag that had, you know, some areas of orange on them and pictures of oranges and the gummies and so on. In this case, it's going to be a little bit different. So maybe what we'll do is we'll start off a little bit by rebalancing some of that light, and then making our way through the rest of it.
Perfect.
I'm
I've just
downloading
uploaded that, by the way, on our
downloading.
Google Drive. Cool. And hopefully, yeah, if we have time, we can take a little look at some subsurface, because I know how, sort of like, in comparison to previous methods, it's really nice and simple and allows us to just play around with sliders, which, as we all know, is how I love to do things.
Yeah, it's so much easier now. And it's very intuitive for the creative type like myself, because you can ultimately just know what a color, you know, just your scatter color and your radius color, whatever are, and then you can just play with the sliders and you make it work. It's kind of like, you know, you don't have to know a ton about it anymore. So
It's an artist-friendly way of using subsurface, as opposed to, what was it before? Sort of like attenuation something, and
yeah, I forget now, like the exact yeah, I forget the exact names.
Yeah, if anyone
But
remembers.
I'm glad they're not that. That's all.
Yeah, I'm glad about that too. Yeah, weight and scale, perfect. That's all I need.
Yeah.
Also, let me know when you want me to ping it to your screen.
Sure. I'm getting pretty close here.
Yeah, that's cool. And if anyone has any questions as well, in the meantime, then do let us know. And if you want any of these files, I know we've probably talked about this in the previous weeks, then I'm sure like both me and Dustin are more than happy to put together this as like a whole file for people to play around with, including like the PSDs. Perks of making everything from scratch. We can give you everything.
Yeah, so I do see one from Lachlan here. What's the best method for turning the black and white pattern into a normal map? Oh man, I don't. Does Photoshop still have the normal map settings?
Yeah,
I thought they.
yeah.
I thought at some point they were getting rid of that. I haven't used that in a while. After using Substance a bit.
It's been a while. I know. I thought you could. Oh yeah, hang on. It's like 3D something. Let me get on here and actually do it with a thing that I can actually do. So what was it? It's in one of these, I thought. Maybe not. Is it because I'm in a beta version? Probably. Under filters. Under filter gallery. So I'm kind of like half looking at George's comments in the chat.
No, it's usually under filters and it will say 3D. So it's probably,
Yeah, I
you know
thought
what? Let me open Photoshop here, and I'll just see.
maybe
I'll
I need
just
to
look on my
have
side.
not the beta version open.
You know,
Oh,
as much as I love Photoshop, I had to uninstall the beta version because it did that often,
mm,
and it would open the beta version when I was working on projects. And the cool part about it is that they have a fairly agile setup with Photoshop where they're releasing new updates to the beta to the beta to the beta, but it that can get in the way of some production work. And so when I'd start working on a project and then things would change a little bit, if I had to go back and make tweaks and back and forth. So yeah,
mm.
long story short, like try to work in the main version
I'm working the main
when
one.
you can.
Long story short, just don't do what I do most of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
So
yeah, it was right.
yeah,
It's
there you go. Yep, it's there. So you have, generate bump map, generate normal map, I believe. And I guess something I could add to that a bit is understanding that you don't always need a normal map. So really knowing the differences between the two and what you need when you need it. Most of the time, I get away with just using a grayscale map, in the height field instead of the tangent space normals. So it's really I don't even want to say user preference because there's definitely a time and a place, but you can do a lot of stuff just with regular bump maps still.
yeah,
All right, so we can share the screen.
yeah.
Move that
So I'll switch
over.
over. There we go.
Start my render view a minute. Possibly. We'll see what happens. Hey, there we go. All right, so we'll do what we did the other week. Kind of move this down, get out of my brush tool. There we go. All right, so first things first, looking at the gummy here. So the gummy is completely white. I think we're fine with that. In fact, we can maybe start to adjust some of the materials on that. And so we can just create a new material, give that a moment, and place that right on the gummy. And what we'll do is we'll start off with our base color. And so I think we'll just use the attribute manager for this. Oh, it's thinking. Not sure what it's thinking about. Happy Monday, everyone. I feel like this is so great because we do this all the time. Like this is normal. It's fine. Everything's fine.
What we could do as well, as I didn't do this, but I don't know if we've done this inside of the render settings. We can change the passes and make them less, the progressive passes.
Yeah, we
Once
we can do that.
I do that sometimes just so it doesn't have to worry about doing like a 1024 progressive pass. That's just sometimes something I do.
Yeah, I usually don't have that issue. It looks like we're good now.
It's
Okay.
because you're live streaming.
Yeah, it just had to think for a minute.
Mm.
So, all right. Let's see. The gummy material, I'm gonna name that. There we go. And what we'll do is make this a nice orange. So I like to use the color picker when I already have things kind of in the scene that are working with a similar color. So we'll use the color picker and maybe choose one of the darker kind of orange colors there to get us started. And I like to use that as a base just so that I can get there. And then I'll head in and adjust the value most of the time. So we are going to add some subsurface to this here in a bit. So we'll start off with our base color is a little bit darker, and we can right click that and copy it. And then we'll head down to the reflection. We can increase our roughness to maybe 0.4. And then we'll head down to our subsurface here, and we can right click, and I guess we didn't copy that, did we? All right, so I'm just going to copy one of my gummies to make that work faster. And then we can simply click and drag down to our radius to copy that same color over, and then we can adjust. So clicking and dragging is pretty nice. You can also copy and paste those color swatches when you're getting in close there. So I know that we're bouncing around a little bit. Kind of started talking about lighting, but I'm like, we might as well just sort of set up a little bit before we start to talk about the weight and the radius scale and so on. So the color is going to be your subsurface color. All right, it's going to be the color like of that object. A lot of times, what I'll do, depending on the subject, I guess, that I'm applying materials to, is I will take my base color and I'll plug that base color into the color, and then make some slight adjustments using more like a color correction node to that specific map for the radius. Maybe I can show that one of these weeks, or maybe in another series. We can talk about, I think I did it with the Raptor that I used in the compositing series that I did. And so you can add bits of subsurface using the same colors and slight variations of them. Anyways, in most cases, your color is going to be the darker version, and then the radius color is going to be what you see around the edges and how you want that to be manipulated. I could go into a lot of detail about that, but I don't think we need to in this case. All right, so we have our darker orange. We have our lighter yellow. In fact, I like this yellow here on the bag, so I'm actually going to sample kind of a lighter version of that for now. And then we'll just drop that value just a little bit. So we can start here. We'll talk about the actual subsurface in a moment. But now that we see the lighting in our scene, there are definitely things that we may want to adjust here. So when we're talking colors of the overall scene that we want to work with, usually you're going to want to make a background color that's complementary to the product that you have, in this space here. So if I'm working with orange, and oftentimes more of an orangish yellow, I like to use more of like a cyan, or kind of getting towards like a blue background. So, these things obviously we could change in Photoshop very quickly, and that's also an option that I use a lot. But what we can do is head into our camera and see. Remember, I put that color on the camera and I still had to look for where it was at because I forgot that I made it yellow to begin with. Yeah, so good times. All right, so for the background, we can set our background to override, and then we can choose our color here, and we'll just kind of twirl this down. There we go. Don't think too hard about it. And now what we can do is maybe select kind of one of the golden yellow colors here that's on the bag, and we'll focus on the bag first rather than the gummies, because we do know that the gummies are going to have some yellow in that subsurface once we get to it. And then what I like to use here is actually the color wheels. So we can click onto a color wheel, and then we'll see that you have different settings down here in the color wheel. So you can work with complementary, you can work with tertiary colors, you can work with split complements, and so on. And so I'll just run with the direct. Now from here, if I click on this blue color on the other side, you'll see that we can run with the direct complement of that color, and go all the way to the other side of the color wheel. So from here, I usually use a little bit of kind of personal preference, and I make adjustments to the values that we have here. So sometimes a little bit less saturated than the direct. So could be a little bit more of a sky blue, something like that, but it at least stands out pretty well and kind of shows off the gummies. So that's usually how I would do it, especially if I'm looking for something more in render. And then once I get to the Photoshop side is where I might go in and add some nice gradients and different, maybe God ray effects to the background and so on, just to kind of spruce it up a bit. All right, so we have those set. We have a background in, and now we're looking at the way that the letters are blown out from our key light. So we can head up to our key light here, and we can turn this off and on and see the contribution that we have from that. So what I think we're going to do at this point is we can close the material manager for now, but we'll select the new jelly bag, just so that we have that active. There we go. Can move these out and maybe kind of truncate this render view a little bit since we aren't really going to need that as much. All right, so inside of the perspective view, at this point, we can start to move this key light around, and we can rebalance where some of those highlights are happening. Instead of actually dialing down the direct intensity of the light, we could just move the light back. And we'll see that now we're starting to get some of that same positioning, but we're getting a lot less of the blown out highlights that are happening here. So it's one way that I like to work. I feel like it helps a lot when you're getting to, this stage in a rendering process is just moving your lights instead of scaling them all down, because then you have to go in and adjust intensity and do multiple different things in that case. Sometimes what you will need to do is as you move it further, you may have to reposition for some of the highlights that you actually have on that light. And so we'll do that. I'll back up a little bit here so we can see it better. So now if we want a little bit more of those highlights to fall right on the front of the bag here, we can move our light over and then slightly readjust from there. Sweet. Okay, so a couple things that we didn't have before that we do now is the bump system. And where did we get was that the jelly bag normal that actually had that in there to begin with?
Yeah, that was from the original material.
Ah, that's right. And we applied just a standard gray over that, which is why we didn't have that in the last one.
Yeah.
And so what we can do is take a look at the bag without those reflections, or without those the normal maps. There we go. And we can see that we have the highlight here, and it's working a lot closer to what we had before. So we can plug the bump map in, and now we have a little bit more of kind of a nicer detail that's going on. So I really like it on the bottom part of the bag, and possibly not as much on the top of the bag here. Maybe kind of hard to see on the stream, but that light is definitely reflecting in a much different manner throughout all of these. So what I could do is head into my bump blender. There we go. And see where that's coming from. So that's the base input. So we can actually head into the bump node here, and we'll take our height scale down to maybe 0.25. See if we can find a balance in here that still shows it, but maybe not as harsh. All right, so we'll go to 0.5 there. And then from this point, what we'll do is now we can adjust the exposure of that just a little bit. So intensity and exposure, I get a lot of questions from people exactly how I like to use intensity and exposure when I'm working with lighting. I primarily use the exposure slider only when I like the general lighting in the scene, but it might just be too hot in certain areas. And in this case, I don't really want to go through the whole process of light linking specific lights to the gummies and the bag, because I feel overall it could work pretty well. And so what I'll do is I'll take the exposure and just bring that down slightly. That may have even been too far. Doesn't need to go too far with it. And now we can see that the jelly's copy here is getting a lot easier to read through that light. And we're kind of assuming that we're not really wanting to do a ton in post. And what I mean by that is we're not going to export all of our render layers and rebuild the beauty pass and do things like that. Like in Photoshop for something like this, I would maybe go and hit camera raw to boost some of the shadows and do those things. We'll talk about that in later parts of the month here. But in this one, I definitely don't want to go and rebuild every beauty layer, especially if we have, 40 different renders of this package and have those across all variations. It gets out of hand really quickly. So we can leave this as is for now. And what we'll do is turn on our yellow camera. There we go. We'll turn our bokeh back on. And we can tone that down a bit. So we'll go to maybe a 2.8 aperture for this. Maybe higher. We'll do f4. There we go. So we'll sit in this area for now. And, oh, it's thinking again. I may actually have to adjust my passes, Elly. That was a good call.
It's just like a habit that I've got into now. It's just, I'm also working on a Mac, so.
Okay. All right. So there we go. Oh, maybe not. One too many clicks, and then you wait again.
Also, I love that you showed that like the complementary color on like the color wheel. I love that workflow of like choosing the main color in your render and then finding the opposite or the complementary one. I think it's such a cool little hack.
Yeah, it's such a smooth process, and I used to do that a lot in Photoshop before they removed the color wheels. Yeah, we won't talk about that, but I liked that process quite a bit. Okay, so let's talk about the gummies now. We'll just go over to that because it's not liking whatever I'm doing. It doesn't seem like I'm doing a whole lot. So we'll see here. All right, so down to the subsurface, we can close quite a few of these out, including the base color. So down in subsurface, we have our color, which is going to be the color of our subsurface. We have the weight here, so we can take that all the way up to 1. And we'll see that we have kind of looks like gummy vitamins. Have you ever seen those? The little, yeah. That's
the chewable ones. Yeah.
And so sometimes the value of 1 can actually work out pretty well. And so I kind of slam some of the sliders depending on the objects that I'm working with. So we'll leave this one here for now. And so our radius color, as we said, is going to be the color that's getting scattered through. It's going to be the color that you choose to have where the subsurface is working. We can make this something like blue. And we can see here that we're currently scattering that blue color, mixing that with the orange color. There we go. Oh, we don't even have our camera showing. I keep seeing that my camera gets disconnected, but that's all good for now, I guess.
Oh no, it's because I thought I kept moving us around. So apologies to everyone in the chat. I was kind of like moving us around based on what like menu you're working. I thought I'm gonna remove us now.
It's all good. It's working out. So scatter color is going to be the color, or sorry, the radius is going to be the color that you're going to scatter through your object where it's most or least dense. So we can make this something closer to that yellow that we had previously. And now we get to scale. And Elly, you said this is going to be based on centimeters.
So yeah, it's based on whatever like DCC you're using, whatever the units are. And so for C4D, it's centimeters.
Right.
And so yeah, this is in centimeters, like distance.
Yeah, and so we'll probably just go small. So we'll do 0.1, and then we can step it up from there. So as we start to step this up, we'll see that we're starting to get some more light that's shining through the edges here.
Yeah, so it's like how far the light will travel into the volume based on centimeters. Yeah.
So I think we'll just go straight to 0.5 because they are pretty small, but I think they have enough size. There you go. And we're starting to see some of that here. So in this one specifically, or in this area, let's turn off the bokeh. Even though I love the bokeh, we'll turn it off. Just make everything milky. But this will help us see it a lot better. There we go. So we're able to start seeing this in some of the gummies that we have, where down here towards the core, we're getting a lot less of that scatter that's going through there. And so the way that I'll manipulate this most of the time is I'll find a radius that works or a scale that works to where, in this case, I have the edges of the gummy that are turning more yellow. And then what I'll do is I'll actually either decrease the scattering weight or I'll adjust the color that we're scattering through. So if we go less in value, it's still going to kind of mean less in weight. And so we can do that pretty easily by taking our value down further. We'll see how this looks here. And maybe what I'll do is we could turn off our camera, select our gummy. We could just zoom straight into it here. And then out this way. There we go. So that'll help out just a little bit to kind of see what's happening on one of them that is working out quite perfectly. So we could smooth this out, but I think right now for the way that it's working, especially with the bokeh turned on, I think it'll work fine, but we get the point across. So we have the yellow scattering here on the outside. And if we go into, back down into our subsurface, there we go. Right now we're working at a value of 9%. If we were to go all the way up to 100, we're going to see that that gummy is pretty much going to be fully saturated with light there. And so we can find somewhere in one of these lower values that's going to work quite well for us. And even turning into a bit more of a red color can definitely help. And there we go. So now these are getting much closer to the colors that we're seeing on the packaging as we're looking at that. Go back into our camera so we can get a nice blue background again. And there's our gummies. So the ones that are closer to the key light over on the left side here, you can see that they're scattering quite a bit, right? Those are going to be more of that yellow hue. And then as we start to get further from the light, we're going to be able to start seeing more of those variations. So light intensity on the subject definitely plays a part. And so you'll want to be careful with that as you're starting to go through your scene. And, you know, in this case, I'm really not too concerned with it because I can make some very quick adjustments in Photoshop that wouldn't be too bad, since most of the gummies in this scene now are all working out pretty well. Including the ones down here at the bottom. You can see quite a difference in variation with the way that they're scattering down here. So those work out quite well. We can back out of this just a little bit. Do we have any questions?
Not that I can see. Rosie was wondering about the PSD files, and is it only PSD files that will let you filter through layers? Yeah, as long as you save it as a .psd, you'll have access to layers. So you were saying about using Clip Studio, Dustin. I don't know if you're familiar. I'm not, but if you're able to save out as a PSD file, then yeah, you're all good.
Yeah, I would think anything that allows you, I think you're right. Anything that allows you to save out or export a PSD file. I think Clip Studio can do that. I believe GIMP can do that. Don't quote me on all of this. Because I really do only use
live. Oh.
Yeah, you know, but I think Affinity does as well. Is kind of cross compatible and can save PSDs. So that works out. It works out quite well in that space. So as far as the lighting is concerned, this is definitely one of the shots that I would, you know, or one of the points that I would use to send off and, you know, get some feedback on. You know, one of the things that I've found is that as a creative, I can spend hours, like countless hours, tweaking and manipulating and adjusting things just to have the client come back and say, hey, well, we liked it 5 versions ago. Can we go back to that? And so I like to send out incremental, you know, bits of feedback for those rounds before I kind of go into my dead space and don't like life so much. So what I would usually do I will just say kind of on my personal side, is I would get into adding roughness maps to the gummies, maybe some slight bump maps to those as well to kind of break it up and maybe not make it look like rubber, but similar to how we did with the bag. I know we're over time, so I don't want to go way too crazy today because it'll be another 2 hour stream, and then it's that we start losing people to the glazing eye effect. But adding roughness maps to things like gummies and the little imperfections, maybe a bump map or even blending a bump map in there, that's going to give us some of that nice like texture on top of it. It's just some irregularities is always really good. And then pushing a little bit further would maybe be intensifying a little bit of the chromatic aberration that we have. And then, like I said, once we move into Photoshop, we can definitely adjust some of the background colors, add a nice burst of light behind the bag, and definitely leave some room for any ad copy or anything like that that the client would want to put on here. So at this point, I feel like we're pretty good for today. And then next week, we get into a bit more of the kind of juicy, fun stuff. So
yeah,
we'll
I was
kick
going to say,
out.
do you want to sort of, I know we're over time, do a little kind of like short thing of what's happening next week? Because it's AOVs, right?
Yeah. So next week, we're going to be talking about AOVs. Are you here next week, Elly?
I am.
Okay. So, yeah, we get to have a whole fun discussion on AOVs and how those are exactly going to work. So there's a couple different ways that I like to work with AOVs specifically. And without showcasing it, we could talk about it and it will be a lot faster. But we're going to talk about, obviously how to use puzzle mats, for the different elements that we have here. So realistically, it's going to be the background, the gummies, and the bag are going to be the three colors that we're going to work with. We may actually choose just to render this as a PNG and have that transparency so that we can move into Photoshop. We'll discuss, how to do that and when to do that, why to do that. But the puzzle mats are going to be key for this. I definitely like to render out my specular passes. And so we'll talk about those and why I like to use those quite often. And then I think we can get into, how to store certain colors to AOVs, which might be, I think for something like this, it would still be very reasonable to talk about because a lot of times you're rendering out client projects that have certain decals, stickers, logos on their product that they want perfect and manipulated in post. And so we can store certain colors from our materials to AOVs so that we can further tweak those in Photoshop. So those would be the main ones. And then we'll start getting into, discussing how you could take that further with, the depth passes and things like that as we move on. So there's going to be a lot of discussion on that. It's going to be fun.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it then.
Sweet. We did it without... we're only 15 minutes over right now.
That's what we call a success.
Yes.
All right, cool. Well, yeah, I suppose we can wrap this up. Dustin, as always, thanks. I love being on these streams with you. I'm looking forward to next week. And then only one more week after that. But yeah, it's been a good one. And thanks to everyone for comments, questions. We appreciate it. If you have any comments and questions for us, feel free to drop them on the YouTube video. And then we can always come around to them. Or training at maxon.net, and then I'm sure one of us can check that out. But as always, awesome. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been good. It's been good.
It has been good. And like you said, only 15 minutes. So
only 15 minutes.
That's a win.
It's been far worse. What is time anyway? Okay.
All right, cool. I suppose, we'll wrap this up. But again, Dustin, thank you. And looking forward to seeing you all next week.
Sounds good. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.